The hardest part about having money isn't making it, it's keeping it after you've spent a lifetime earning it. You've worked 40 years for your money. Now comes the part nobody prepares you for, making sure your money works 40 more for you, without losing your peace of mind in the process. This is where most people stumble, not because they're foolish, but because the rules change completely when the paychecks stop coming. Charlie Munger understood this better than almost anyone who ever lived. Warren Buffett's partner, the man behind Berkshire Hathaway's quiet brilliance, spent nearly a century thinking about money, mistakes, and what it means to live wisely. He died in November 2023, just 1 month shy of his 100th birthday, leaving behind not just a fortune, but a philosophy, a way of thinking about wealth that matters most when you need it to last. Before we continue, a word of clarity. Nothing you hear today is financial advice. This is education, reflection, a conversation about wisdom. Your money is yours to steward. Seek counsel from those who know your full story before making any decisions. And if this resonates with you, if you find value in these reflections, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment below. Let me know what you're learning, what you're struggling with, or what wisdom you've discovered on your own journey. This channel grows because people like you care about thoughtful, grounded conversations about money and life. Now, here's the question worth asking. What if the greatest danger to your retirement isn't market crashes or inflation, but the quiet mistakes you make when no one's watching? The ones born from fear, from impulse, from listening to the wrong voices at the wrong time. Charlie Munger spent his life studying failure. While most investors obsessed over winning strategies, Munger became fascinated with losing ones. He believed the secret to success wasn't just knowing what to do, but religiously avoiding what destroys you. Invert, he would say. Always invert. If you want to know how to retire well, first understand how people ruin their retirements. And after a lifetime of observation, 3 mistakes stood out above all others. 3 traps that catch even intelligent people off guard, especially in the years after 60, when margin for error evaporates and consequences compound with cruel efficiency. The first mistake is the deadliest. It's also the most seductive. Chasing yield when you can least afford to lose. Picture this. You're 65, maybe 68. The paychecks have stopped. You've got a nest egg. Maybe it's $300,000, maybe it's $1 million, maybe it's somewhere in between. You've done the math. You know Social Security won't cover everything. You need your savings to generate income, to fill the gap, to let you live without fear. So you start looking for yield. You need that money to work harder. 5% isn't enough. You start noticing investments promising 8, 10, 12% returns. Dividend stocks that seem safe. High-yield bonds that sound reasonable. Maybe a friend mentions a real estate investment trust that's paying out like clockwork. Maybe someone at church talks about a private lending opportunity with impressive monthly distributions. And you think, if I could just get a little more yield, I'd be fine. I'd sleep better. I wouldn't have to worry so much about running out. This is where it begins. This is the trap. Charlie Munger watched this story play out thousands of times over his long life. He saw intelligent people, successful people, people who'd saved responsibly for decades get wiped out, chasing an extra few percentage points of income. He saw them pile into investments they didn't understand, lured by promises that sounded reasonable but were built on sand. Here's what Munger knew that most retirees forget. The higher the yield, the higher the risk. Always, without exception. The market isn't stupid. If something is paying 10% while everything else pays 4, there's a reason. Either the investment is riskier than you think, or the income isn't sustainable, or both. But when you're living on a fixed income, when you're watching your savings and wondering if it'll last, that logic gets harder to hold on to. Fear makes you reach. Desperation makes you rationalize. You start telling yourself stories. This is different. This is backed by real assets. The company has been around for 20 years. My neighbor's been collecting checks for months. Munger would sit in those Berkshire meetings year after year, and he'd say the same thing in different ways. Risk comes from not knowing what you're doing. And when you're 70 years old, you don't have time to recover from not knowing what you're doing. He lived through the Great Depression as a child. He watched his family struggle. He saw what happens when people lose everything because they reached for something they couldn't afford to lose. That experience marked him. It made him permanently cautious, permanently aware that catastrophe is always closer than you think. When Munger built his own wealth, he did it slowly, carefully, without dramatics. He didn't need to swing for the fences because he understood something most people learned too late. Survival beats brilliance every single time. Getting rich is optional. Staying solvent is mandatory. After 50, the math changes completely. Before 50, you can take risks because you have time to recover. You can afford a bad year, even a bad decade, because your paycheck keeps coming and compound interest still has room to work miracles. But after 65, after 70, time is no longer on your side. One bad decision can haunt you for the rest of your life. Munger was ruthless about this. He had no patience for financial products designed to extract fees from retirees by promising safety and income. He hated annuities with complicated terms. He despised structured notes and synthetic dividends and anything that required a glossy brochure to explain. If you can't understand it in 10 minutes, he'd say, you shouldn't own it. His solution was almost boring in its simplicity. Own good businesses, not complicated ones, not exciting ones, good ones. Companies that make products people need, run by people who don't lie, trading at prices that don't require you to believe in miracles, and accept reality. Accept that in a low-interest rate world, safe money doesn't pay much. Accept that 4% might be all you get. Accept that you might need to adjust your lifestyle instead of adjusting your risk tolerance. This is hard medicine. Nobody wants to hear that they need to live on less, that their expectations might be unrealistic, that the retirement they imagined might require compromise. But Munger believed in facing reality head-on, no matter how uncomfortable. He'd rather you be disappointed by truth than destroyed by fantasy. There's a story from the early 2000s during the dot-com crash. Munger watched people in their 60s and 70s get decimated because they'd loaded up on tech stocks and high-flying funds chasing the returns everyone else was getting. These weren't stupid people. They were teachers and engineers and small business owners who'd worked hard and saved diligently. But they got caught up in the fever. They abandoned discipline at precisely the moment discipline mattered most. Munger didn't gloat. He just got quieter, more insistent. He kept saying the same thing over and over. The first rule of compounding is to never interrupt it unnecessarily. And the way you interrupt it is by losing money you can't afford to lose, chasing returns you don't need, in investments you don't understand. By the time you're 65, the margin for error is gone. This isn't pessimism, it's mathematics. You can't afford a 50% loss because even if the market recovers, you're drawing down principal the whole time. You're selling shares at depressed prices to pay for groceries and medicine. The hole gets deeper even as the market climbs back. Munger's advice was to get boring before it's too late. Hold cash. More than feels comfortable. Keep 2 years of expenses liquid, maybe 3. Own bonds, even if they're not exciting. Own dividend-paying companies with long histories of stability. Not because they'll make you rich, but because they probably won't make you poor. And most importantly, ignore the noise. Ignore the financial media selling hope and fear in equal measure. Ignore the newsletters promising secret strategies. Ignore your brother-in-law who's always got a hot tip. The older you get, the more valuable boring becomes. This is the first great mistake retirees make. They abandon safety when they need it most. They reach for yield when they should be reaching for sleep at night. They confuse income with return and forget that the income doesn't matter if the principal disappears. Charlie Munger avoided this his entire life. Even as he got richer, he got more conservative with the money that mattered. He understood that wealth isn't what you make, it's what you keep. And keeping it requires saying no to almost everything. The second mistake is subtler, but just as dangerous. Trusting the wrong people at the wrong time. Retirement makes you vulnerable in ways you don't expect, not just financially, but emotionally. You've left the structure of work. Your identity shifts. Your social circle changes. You have more time to think, to worry, to second-guess yourself. And into that vulnerability walks an entire industry designed to sell you solutions, to position themselves as the expert you need, the guide who'll make sense of it all. Some of these people are good. Some are competent and honest and have your best interest at heart. But many aren't. And telling the difference gets harder when you're anxious about money and mortality is no longer theoretical. Munger was deeply skeptical of the financial services industry. Not entirely dismissive, but skeptical. He'd seen too much. Too many advisors churning accounts to generate fees. Too many insurance salesmen disguised as financial planners. Too many smooth-talking professionals whose incentives ran opposite to their clients' well-being. He had a test he'd apply. He'd ask, how does this person get paid? Because how someone gets paid tells you everything about whose interests they're serving. If they get paid based on what you buy, they have an incentive to sell you things. If they get paid based on how often you trade, they have an incentive to make you trade. If they get paid based on assets under management, they have an incentive to gather as much of your money as possible and keep it there, regardless of whether that's what you need. Munger believed the best financial advice often comes from people with no financial incentive to give it. A trusted friend who's been through it. A family member who understands money. Someone whose wisdom comes from experience, not commission splits. But here's what happens in retirement. You get scared. Markets drop 20%, and suddenly that nest egg you thought was solid looks fragile. Or your spouse gets sick, and the medical bills start piling up, and you need help navigating insurance and estate planning and tax implications. Or you inherit money from a parent, and you're not sure what to do with it. In those moments of vulnerability, it's easy to hand over control to someone who sounds confident, who has credentials, who promises to handle everything. And sometimes that works out fine. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you wake up 5 years later and realize you've been paying 2% annually for a portfolio of expensive mutual funds you could have replicated yourself for a tenth of the cost. Sometimes you discover the annuity you bought has surrender charges that trap you for a decade. Sometimes the advisor who seemed so helpful was really just a salesman hitting quota. Munger's guidance here was characteristically blunt. Nobody cares about your money as much as you do. Nobody. Not your advisor, not your broker, not your insurance agent. They might care about you. They might be genuinely trying to help. But at the end of the day, it's not their money on the line, it's yours. And that difference matters. He believed in radical personal responsibility when it came to finances. Even if you hire help, you need to understand what's happening. You need to know what you own, why you own it, what it costs, and how your advisor gets compensated. You need to ask questions until things make sense. And if someone gets defensive or evasive when you ask questions, that tells you everything you need to know. There's a particular version of this mistake that Munger found especially tragic. It happens when adult children get involved in their aging parents' finances, sometimes with good intentions, sometimes without. An adult son convinces his mother to move money around in ways that benefit him more than her. A daughter pressures her father to invest in her business, to co-sign a loan, to help out just this once. An entire family starts viewing the retirement nest egg as a shared resource, available for everyone's emergencies and opportunities. Munger was protective of retirees' autonomy. He believed that once you've earned your money and saved it, you have the right to spend your final decades free from financial pressure, even from family. Especially from family, because that's where guilt and obligation make it hardest to say no. He'd tell a story sometimes, never with names, about a man he knew who'd saved diligently his whole life. Modest lifestyle, careful spending, solid nest egg. Then his kids started having problems. One needed help with a down payment. Another had a business idea that just needed some seed capital. A third was going through a divorce and needed to borrow against the inheritance anyway, so why not early? The man couldn't say no. These were his children. He wanted to help. So piece by piece, the nest egg got depleted. Not stolen, nothing illegal, just eroded by love and guilt and the inability to disappoint the people who mattered most. By the time the man was in his 80s, the money was gone. The kids were fine, more or less. But the father who'd provided for everyone his whole life ended up dependent on Social Security and whatever his children could spare. Munger found this heartbreaking, not because he was cold or ungenerous, but because he understood that protecting yourself financially isn't selfish. It's necessary. If you give away your security, you don't become noble. You become a burden, and nobody wins. His advice was simple but difficult. Learn to say no. Practice it. Get comfortable disappointing people when your financial survival is at stake. Your retirement money is not an emergency fund for your family. It's not seed capital for your nephew's startup. It's not a loan pool for your friends. It's your life raft. Treat it accordingly. This doesn't mean you can't be generous. Munger gave away hundreds of millions over his lifetime, but he gave strategically when he could afford it, in ways that didn't compromise his security. There's a difference between generosity and self-destruction. One comes from strength. The other comes from weakness disguised as virtue. The financial industry counts on retirees not asking hard questions. They count on you being polite, trusting authority, not wanting to seem difficult or suspicious. They count on complexity creating dependency. The more confusing they make things, the more you need them to explain it. Munger's approach was the opposite. Simplify everything until you understand it completely. Own things you can explain to a 12-year-old. If someone's selling you an investment that requires a whiteboard and 45 minutes to understand, walk away. Complexity is usually a tax on the confused. And here's the truth that nobody in a suit wants you to know. The vast majority of retirees don't need complicated financial planning. They need a budget, an emergency fund, a simple mix of stocks and bonds appropriate for their age, maybe an annuity for baseline expenses if they're particularly risk-averse, and the discipline to stick with it. That's it. Everything else is noise designed to generate fees. Munger lived this. His personal investments were famously concentrated and simple. He owned pieces of businesses he understood, held them forever, and didn't mess around. He didn't need hedge funds or private equity or alternative investments. He didn't chase the latest trend or worry about missing out. He knew what he owned, why he owned it, and he slept well. The second mistake retirees make is trusting too easily and questioning too little. It's letting vulnerability turn into dependence. It's outsourcing your financial brain to someone whose interests might not align with yours. It's assuming credentials equal wisdom and confidence equals competence. Charlie Munger never assumed any of that. He questioned everything. He did his own thinking, and he believed you should too, especially when your security is on the line. The third mistake might be the most painful because it's about something deeper than money. Letting envy steal your peace in the final stretch. By the time you reach 60, 70, 80 years old, you'd think you'd be done comparing yourself to others. You'd think you'd have made peace with your choices, your path, the life you built. But for many retirees, the opposite happens. The comparison game intensifies. The neighbor who retired with more. The friend whose kids are more successful. The couple from church who travel to Europe every year while you're clipping coupons. Social media makes it worse. But this isn't a new problem. Munger watched envy destroy people's happiness long before Instagram existed. He called it one of the most toxic human emotions, right up there with resentment and self-pity. And he noticed that it often peaks in retirement, when you finally have time to look around and measure yourself against everyone else. Here's why this matters financially. Envy makes you spend money you don't have trying to appear successful to people you don't even like. It makes you take risks to catch up to someone who might be heading toward a cliff. It makes you dissatisfied with enough, always reaching for more, never arriving at contentment. Munger believed that envy was particularly dangerous because it's the only one of the 7 deadly sins that isn't any fun. At least with gluttony, you get to eat. With lust, there's pleasure involved. But envy? Pure suffering with no upside. You just torture yourself watching other people enjoy things. For retirees, this plays out in predictable ways. You worked hard, saved diligently, did everything right. But somehow, your nest egg is smaller than you expected. The house isn't paid off yet. The pension isn't as generous as you'd hoped. Meanwhile, your buddy from work retired 2 years ago and seems to be living large. New car, renovated kitchen, talking about a cruise to Alaska. So you start spending to keep up. You buy things you don't need to prove something to people who aren't paying attention. You take trips you can't afford because everyone else is traveling. You give money to your grandchildren because your brother gives money to his, and you don't want yours to feel less loved. You maintain a lifestyle that requires you to draw down your principal faster than you should, all because the alternative feels like admitting defeat. Munger would say this is insanity. You're destroying your security to manage your ego. You're spending your future to impress your present. And the people you're trying to impress are mostly too worried about their own lives to care about yours. He had a phrase he loved. Envy is the only sin where you feel terrible and get nothing in return. He'd repeat it in different contexts, hammering home the point. Of all the ways to ruin your life, envy might be the dumbest because you do it to yourself voluntarily. There's a deeper reason Munger cared about this. He understood that retirement isn't just a financial transition. It's an identity transition. Your whole adult life, you've been defined by what you do, your job, your career, your professional accomplishments. Then suddenly, that's gone. You're no longer the manager, the executive, the professional. You're just you. And if you haven't cultivated an inner life, if your self-worth was entirely tied to external validation, retirement can feel like falling off a cliff. This is when people start measuring themselves by net worth, by their house, by their car, by where their kids went to college. They need something to point to, some external marker that says they matter, they succeeded, they're worthy of respect. And if those markers don't measure up to the neighbors, the shame can be overwhelming. Munger lived differently. He certainly had wealth, more than most people could imagine, but he never seemed to need it for validation. He lived in the same house for decades, drove modest cars, didn't show off. His satisfaction came from learning, from reading, from thinking clearly, from good conversation. He built a life so intellectually rich that external validation became irrelevant. That's the secret he'd want retirees to understand. The only way to escape the trap of comparison is to build a life that's satisfying on its own terms, not because it looks good to others, but because it feels good to you. And here's what that means practically. It means defining enough. What's enough money? Enough house? Enough travel? Enough to leave your kids? If you don't define it, you'll never reach it. You'll spend your whole retirement chasing a moving target, always feeling behind, always dissatisfied. Munger defined enough early and stuck to it. Once he had financial security, once his family was taken care of, once he knew he could live comfortably for the rest of his life, he stopped caring about getting richer. He kept investing because he loved the game, not because he needed more money. That distinction mattered. It freed him from anxiety. It let him take risks with his investments that he'd never take with his lifestyle. For retirees, this is liberating. Once you know you have enough, once you've defined what that means and you've reached it, you can stop. You can stop worrying about the market. You can stop comparing yourself to others. You can stop chasing yield and taking risks and trying to keep up. You can just live. But most people never do this calculation. They never sit down and honestly ask themselves what enough looks like. They just keep accumulating, keep striving, keep feeling anxious because they've never given themselves permission to stop. Munger would encourage you to do this now, today. Get a piece of paper. Write down what you need to live comfortably. Not extravagantly, not to impress anyone, just comfortably. Add a margin for safety. Add some money for fun and travel and helping people you love. Then look at what you have. If you're there, celebrate. You've won. The game is over. You can stop worrying and start living. And if you're not there yet, at least you know what you're aiming for. You can make decisions based on reality instead of vague anxiety. You can distinguish between needs and wants. You can protect yourself from envy because you're measuring against your own definition of success, not someone else's. The third mistake retirees make is letting comparison steal their peace. It's spending money they don't have to impress people they don't like. It's confusing net worth with self-worth. It's reaching the finish line and still running because they can't stop looking over their shoulder. Charlie Munger stopped running decades before he died. Not because he was lazy or complacent, but because he knew where the finish line was and he'd crossed it. He spent his final years reading, learning, spending time with people he loved, and sharing wisdom with anyone who'd listen. He seemed content, not because he had everything, but because he'd defined enough and recognized when he had it. That's the lesson he'd want you to learn. Enough is a decision you make, not a number you reach. And once you make that decision, you're free. Let's step back now and look at the larger picture because these three mistakes aren't really separate. They're connected. They all stem from the same source: fear. Fear that you won't have enough. Fear that you'll lose what you have. Fear that you're falling behind. Fear that your life doesn't measure up. Fear that you made wrong choices and it's too late to fix them. Fear that you'll run out of money before you run out of life. This fear is rational. The stakes are real. But Munger would say that the solution to fear isn't taking bigger risks or trying harder or comparing yourself to others. The solution is building a life and a financial structure so simple and solid that fear has nothing to grab onto. He believed in what he called a margin of safety. This was a concept he borrowed from Benjamin Graham, Warren Buffett's teacher. But Munger took it further. A margin of safety isn't just about investing in companies trading below their intrinsic value. It's about structuring your entire life so that you're protected from your own mistakes, from bad luck, from the unexpected disasters that happen to everyone eventually. For retirees, a margin of safety means keeping more cash than feels comfortable. It means owning your home outright if you can. It means having insurance that actually protects you, not insurance that makes someone else rich. It means spending less than you could afford, so that when the market crashes, or the roof needs replacing, or the medical bills arrive, you're not scrambling. It also means something less tangible. It means building relationships that aren't based on money. It means cultivating interests that don't require wealth. It means creating a daily life that's satisfying whether the market is up or down, whether your friends are traveling to Italy or staying home, whether your retirement account is growing or shrinking. Munger read for hours every day, right up until the end. He'd say that the best investment he ever made was in knowledge. Books cost almost nothing. Libraries are free. The wisdom of humanity's greatest minds is available to anyone with curiosity. You can be intellectually rich regardless of your net worth. He also believed deeply in gratitude as a practice, not as some New Age affirmation exercise, but as a mental discipline. Every day consciously recognize what you have instead of what you lack. Your health, as much as remains. Your family, complicated as they are. Your home, your safety, your autonomy. The fact that you live in a time and place where retirement is even possible, where you're not working until you drop dead, where medical care exists, where you have choices. This isn't toxic positivity. Munger acknowledged suffering and hardship. He lost a son to leukemia at age 9. He went through a divorce. He had plenty of pain in his long life. But he chose gratitude anyway, not because everything was perfect, but because the alternative was bitterness, and bitterness is just another way of ruining the time you have left. For retirees, this matters enormously. You're in the final act. How do you want to spend it? Anxious and envious and grasping for more, or grateful and present and making the most of what is? These aren't just philosophical questions, they're practical ones, because your mindset determines your choices. If you're operating from fear and envy, you'll make the 3 mistakes we've talked about. You'll chase yield, trust the wrong people, and spend money trying to keep up. But if you're operating from gratitude and sufficiency, you'll make better choices. You'll protect what you have. You'll ignore the noise. You'll define enough and recognize when you're there. Munger's final years were spent teaching mostly. He'd show up to those Berkshire meetings, answer questions for hours, share everything he'd learned, hold nothing back. He didn't have to do it. He was 95, 96, 97 years old. He could have stayed home. But he kept showing up because he believed in passing along wisdom, in helping people avoid the mistakes he'd seen destroy others. There was a question someone asked him near the end. How do you want to be remembered? And Munger said something like, I don't spend much time thinking about that. I'm too busy trying to be useful while I'm still here. That's the mindset, not legacy, not reputation, just being useful with whatever time remains. For retirees, this is the great opportunity. You're not done. You still have knowledge to share, experience to offer, time to give. But you can only do that if you're not consumed with financial anxiety, if you've handled the money part well enough that it fades into the background. The 3 mistakes we've explored today, they all rob you of that opportunity. They keep you anxious, distracted, focused on the wrong things. Avoiding them isn't about getting richer, it's about getting free. Free from chasing yield you don't need. Free from trusting people who don't deserve it. Free from comparing yourself to others who aren't even thinking about you. Free to spend your final decades doing what actually matters. Charlie Munger built that freedom for himself. Not just financially, though he certainly did that, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, if we can use that word. He seemed genuinely content with his choices, his life, his path. He didn't appear to have regrets about the things he didn't buy, or the trips he didn't take, or the people he didn't impress. He read. He thought. He talked to people he respected. He gave money away quietly. He showed up for his friend Warren year after year. He maintained his independence and his clarity until the very end. And when he died, just a month before his 100th birthday, he left behind a template for how to think about money and life and what matters when you can see the end approaching. Here's what he'd want you to know as you navigate your own retirement. You don't need to be brilliant. You need to be disciplined. You don't need to get rich. You need to avoid going broke. You don't need to beat the market. You need to stay in the game long enough for the market to carry you forward. Avoid debt. Avoid drama. Avoid dumb risks. Keep things simple. Know what you own. Understand how your advisors get paid. Define enough and recognize when you're there. Spend less than you think you should. Keep more cash than feels comfortable. Ignore what your neighbor is doing with their money. Read more. Learn constantly. Stay curious. Cultivate relationships that matter. Build a life rich in things that cost nothing. And practice gratitude. every single day, not because everything is perfect, but because gratitude is the antidote to envy, to fear, to the creeping dissatisfaction that ruins so many retirements. These aren't complicated ideas. Munger would be the first to say that. Most wisdom isn't complicated. It's just hard to follow because it requires saying no to your impulses, your ego, your fear. It requires discipline when everyone around you is being undisciplined. It requires patience when the world is screaming for action. But the reward is peace, real peace, the kind that lets you sleep at night regardless of what the market did today, the kind that lets you enjoy a simple meal with people you love without worrying whether you should be at a fancier restaurant, the kind that lets you look back on your life and feel satisfied with your choices, even if they don't look impressive to anyone else. This is what Charlie Munger achieved, and this is what he'd want you to achieve, not wealth for its own sake, but security, autonomy, freedom from financial fear, peace of mind in your final years. You've worked hard enough. You've earned the right to stop worrying. But that only happens if you avoid the mistakes that keep you trapped, the reaching for yield, the trusting without questioning, the comparing yourself to others. Make better choices, simpler choices, choices that protect what you have instead of risking it for what you don't need. And then, with whatever time you have left, do something meaningful. Read that book you've been putting off. Call that friend you've been meaning to reach. Help someone who needs it. Learn something just for the joy of learning. Your money is a tool, not the point, never the point. The point is living well with whatever time remains. And living well means being present, being grateful, being free from the anxiety that destroys so many people's final years. Charlie Munger figured this out. He lived it, and he left behind a map for the rest of us. The map is simple. Avoid stupid mistakes. Keep things boring. Define enough. Practice gratitude, and spend your remaining days doing what actually matters to you, not what impresses other people. That's the wisdom. That's the path. And it's available to anyone willing to follow it. You've made it this far. You've saved money. You've planned for retirement. You've done the hard part. Now comes the part that requires wisdom instead of work. Protecting what you have, avoiding the traps, building a life that's satisfying on its own terms. Charlie Munger believed you could do it. He spent nearly a century proving it's possible, and he'd want you to know that it's not too late. Whatever mistakes you've made so far, whatever regrets you carry, you still have time to get this right. Start today. Define enough. Build your margin of safety. Let go of comparison. Protect yourself from your own impulses and from people whose interests don't align with yours. And then stop worrying about money and start living the life you saved for. That's the lesson. That's the gift. That's what Charlie Munger would tell you if he were still here. Be smart. Be careful. Be grateful. Be present. And enjoy the time you have left. You've earned it.